Hello, and welcome to another edition of Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. The topic for this week's Todd Talk is going to be continuing on our theme of collaboration and how to get students to work well in groups, how to get them to be productive in groups, and how to help them to produce better work as a group than they would if they were by themselves. So, one of the biggest challenges with students working in groups is the fairness factor. So, what happens is one person is doing all of the work and the entire group gets credit for that. Or similarly, on the converse side, one student is not doing their work and pulling everyone else's grade down. And so what happens a lot is when we tend to have students work in groups is we give them a group grade. And by giving them a group grade, this is where the fairness factors in, and that students do not feel like the grade is fair because some people worked harder than others, or some people did their role better than others, and so on and so forth. So the best way to go about making sure that students feel like things are fair is to have them play particular roles in the group. And then they have certain responsibilities for this role, and they will be held accountable for those responsibilities. So the question becomes, how do you assign roles? How do you put students in the correct roles? And how do you make sure that what they're doing is going to be benefiting the group? So this was talked about in a prior Todd Talk, but one thing you want to do is start to identify what are the students' strengths and weaknesses. And by doing this, you're creating self-awareness of what people are good at and what they're not. Because oftentimes people will say what they're good at or think what they're good at, but it's not necessarily the case. And like a student may say, I'm so great at technology, and it turns out they don't have that much knowledge when it comes to technology. And there's someone else in the group that has way more. So what you would want to do is you would use an activity. I gave the example in another Todd Talk of the compass points activities, and there are other ones: profile of a student, Gardner's 7 intelligences, learning inventories. But what these do is they break down the strengths of students and then help them to identify what they would be good at and what may be a weakness of theirs that they might want to avoid or have help from someone else. So like I said, it's just as important to know their strengths and weaknesses, what they're not so good at, who do they not work well with, which tasks do they simply avoid. And it's okay to avoid tasks. A lot of time in teaching, we feel the need to make sure that everyone is good at everything, but not great at anything. So instead of trying to take a weakness and prop that weakness up to make it, average, why don't we just take their strengths and make them that much stronger and make sure that the student is really great at their strength? And so by doing this, this makes them more aware so that they can start to assign themselves roles or volunteer for roles because of this awareness. So once they gain this awareness of what they're good at and what their strengths are, then when that opportunity comes up, they can take that role. Another one that I like to use with groups is this right here, a skills inventory. And so this requires it is a self-assessment. So students are saying which ones they're good at. So it has all of these particular skills. And then students identifies ones that they're really good at. And you can even have like a sliding scale. You could have them put like a plus or star for ones that they're really good at, checks for ones that they feel like they're decent at, and minuses for ones that they're poor at. So you can set it up any way you want. But the idea here is that students are going through and self-identifying the skills that they think that they are good at. And then it is kind of important to anchor this. So like I said, some students feel like they're good at things that they may not be good at. So a student thinks they're good at leadership, and it turns out that they're just bossy and they're not really good at leadership. And so there are a couple ways you can anchor this. So one is, if you know your students well enough, you can have conversations with them about what they think they're strong at and what you observe in class that may be contrary to that. Another thing you might do is you might want to put them with other people from the strength that they have identified, so they can see the context of where they play. So if there are 7 people that say that they're really good at public speaking, and you put them in a group together and they begin to talk with one another, and it turns out that some of them are very clearly better than others, then it might give them more self-awareness. So you can do these anchoring sessions. You want to be careful that you're not like the kids aren't, insulting one another or, putting each other down, but rather they're just finding out, what strengths are as compared to others and having a context for their strengths. So Once they have identified their strengths, then whenever there is group work to be done, either you, the teacher, or they, as the group members, assign specific roles within that. So, for example, you could start with a list of possible roles that members could take. And then, so that if you have a group of 5 and you have 8 possible roles that need to be covered, then they would divvy up who's going to take. So there may be 2 people that take one. There may be 1 person that takes one. There may be 3 people that take one. But they're assigning themselves different roles based upon their strengths and what they're able to be successful at. And like I said, using the skills inventory, they should assign themselves based on what they appear to be good at. So you wouldn't take someone who thinks themselves as not being a very strong public speaker and put them in charge of the presentation. And so what happens then is that student then becomes responsible for that aspect of the work. They're held accountable. So if something goes wrong, you are not punishing the entire group. You're not, or I wouldn't say punishing, but you're not, penalizing the entire group. You're penalizing the person that was in charge of that. So, for example, if someone is like you put someone in charge of quality control and they're responsible for making sure the product turns out like it should, and the product does not, then they were the ones who were responsible for doing that. And so you hold them accountable and you have to grade them accordingly, but you don't take off necessarily for the other members of the group who maybe did do what they were supposed to do in regards to their roles. You do need to make sure that you remind students that just because they're responsible for an aspect doesn't mean that they're the only one who works on it. So in other words, there might be someone who is in charge of the research for the group. It doesn't mean that all 4 group members can't do research together. And then that one person then collects that research and organizes it and figures out where it's needed. But they can all still do the research. So it doesn't mean that one person does something and no one else does it. It just means that they're the ones who are being held accountable and responsible for that. So here's an example of some general roles that I would do when I had students work together. So it would be leader, which they're the person who has to keep them on task. A scribe, this is the person that writes what or captures what the group is discussing or what their findings are. A spokesperson that would then speak whenever that group is called upon to share what they have learned. The manager, and this seems similar to the leader, but it's actually a little bit different, which is that they are, the leader keeps people on task. The manager manages time. And time management is a really important skill to have and is one that we kind of overlook sometimes. But, the manager would then make sure that the students are, if they have a deadline, that they're making sure that they are getting the work that they need to get done in time to have their stuff ready before that deadline. And the last one, as I mentioned before, is quality control. And this is the person responsible for making sure that the end product is of high quality. And so, that again, they're the ones who are going to be accountable if it is not of high quality. Even though others may have worked on it, they were responsible for making sure that the group did that. So here's some examples of more specific roles that you might use. So head of research. So this is someone who is overseeing the research, making sure that they're finding whatever evidence they need to make a case for their argument or whatever it is that they're trying to learn about. Presenter, this is the person in charge of the oral presentation for the group. So a lot of times we also get bogged down that in groups that roles must be divided equally, so that if you have a presentation, all 5 group members must present for 5 minutes each. But again, I mean, you're not using people's strengths and weaknesses. There may be strong speakers that if they spoke for 15 minutes would be much better than listening to 2 mediocre speakers speak for their 5 minutes apiece. So in the end, you want a great product. You don't necessarily, and you want to make sure the students are using their strengths. A facilitator is kind of like the leader from before. They keep the group on task, but it's kind of a combination of the leader and the manager, where they're also keeping time management. The liaison, depending upon what you're doing, they may have to have conversations with you as the teacher to check on progress. And so the liaison is the person in charge of communication between the teacher and the group. So if something is going wrong, the liaison goes to talk with them. Or if something is going right and they want to ask clarification, the liaison goes and talks with that teacher. Now, it doesn't mean you as the teacher aren't moving around and talking to all groups. All that means is that this is the designated person to communicate what the group's feelings are with, or what the group's progress is with the teacher. The last one is an oversight. And this is making sure, kind of buttoning up everything and making sure that they're following the criteria, that they're looking over the syllabus, the rubric, or briefing, and they're making sure that what they're being asked to do is what they're doing. And oftentimes what will happen is groups will get, kind of on a tangent, and they end up not producing what it is that they're supposed to be producing or to show mastery. And so this oversight person is checking that all the time to make sure that they are moving where they're supposed to be moving. So when you have them in groups, what I often would do is I would then, when I graded them on a syllabus, is I would give them different grades on the same syllabus. So if there was a presentation aspect to the syllabus, I would, and someone did a really excellent job on the presentation, that their grade may be higher than someone who didn't do the presentation. But if someone who did research was in charge of research, and there's a research aspect, then that person would reap the benefits of that. And it doesn't mean you're taking off for people who didn't speak. It just means you're rewarding for those who spoke well. So how do you keep track of these different roles and what students are doing? This is one example of a graphic organizer that I used in my classroom to keep kids on track. So you can see that along this side of the page, I would have the students actually write out the major tasks that they need to accomplish in what order they were going to accomplish them. So this did a couple of things. It helped them to break down the project and to realize what needed to be done. And so over here, what you see is the goals that the group have created for themselves. So you see that they want to complete the project on time, they want to get an A on the project, and they want to work well together. So those are their personal goals. I didn't create those, the group came up with those. And then you put who's responsible for certain tasks. So for instance, completing the contract and setting the goals, all 4 members of the group are responsible for that. Chad, Bonnie, Tracy, and Ben are all responsible. However, when it comes to researching, only Chad, Bonnie, and Tracy are responsible for the research. And so they're the ones who are going to be doing all the research. In the meantime, Ben is going to be the one in charge of synthesizing that research into bullet points so it's easier to understand. And so you see this tells you who's responsible for things. And so then what I do is then I make X's in here on whether they have, how many days it's taking them and whether they're accomplishing what they're going to accomplish. So what this does, it makes me aware of what the student specific roles are. And it doesn't mean that I'm interfering and saying they're not doing their role. That's their job as a group to keep each other on task and keep them accountable and responsible for their part in the group work. But I will, give friendly reminders if people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing or what their role is. But what this does is it just is a graphic organizer for me as the teacher to keep track of what students are doing, what they're responsible for, and how well they're doing that. So I just put X's here. I could have put pluses if they're doing a really good job, an X if they're just doing an adequate job, a minus if they're doing a poor job. So there are various ways that you can organize that. And so you see the importance of having specific roles when students are working in groups, especially when it comes to making sure that students feel as though things were fair, not equal, but fair, and that students are using their strengths to make sure that they're producing better products than they would had they been working by themselves. So that, that ultimately is the goal of when we work in groups, is that you put together people who have various strengths that are going to make the group that much stronger than an individual who may have some of those weaknesses that other people can make up for with their strengths. And so it is important that when you're doing that you make sure you match up the student with the strength and the role that they're doing, and then make them accountable when you're grading them on that.